All right. Do I go ahead, Zach?
Yeah, you're all good, Kathy.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining Project Learning Tree Canada and Initiative SFI and the Jasmar Group for webinars today on diversity and inclusion in green jobs. And the theme today is the promise of behavioral design. Now, I just want to say, as CEO of Project Learning Tree Canada, it's really important to us since we work on green career pathways in the forest and conservation sector that we think about not only do we have green jobs in the forest sector, and there are so many, but how do we ensure that those jobs are diverse and inclusive for this generation, for the next generation, so that we can build a more resilient and accepting sector where people want to work. At SFI, our vision is a world that values and benefits from sustainably managed forests. And so everything that we do is embedded in that vision and also helping the world make better choices for the planet. And again, we think an inclusive place to work is a better choice for the planet. If you haven't heard about Project Learning Tree Canada, I just want to spend just a couple of minutes to let you know a little bit about what we've been up to. So we're a nonprofit in Canada, as I mentioned, Initiative SFI, and we started our work in January 2018. And in just a few short years, we've had a lot of successes. We've placed over 2,000 youth in the forest and conservation sector in green job experiences ranging from 4 to 16 weeks. And we've done that thanks to our broad and diverse SFI network and the broad and diverse Canadian Parks Council network, which is who we use to place those jobs. We were so thrilled that we had a focus on gender balance, and we achieved that gender balance in our job placements. We also had a very high level of Indigenous youth placed, which is also a priority for us. And while less than 5% of Canada's population is Indigenous, and we were working with youth aged 15 to 30, we were very thrilled that over 12% of our placements went into Indigenous youth, and we want to do better moving forward. And we placed almost a quarter of these jobs in rural places with rural youth as well, which is fantastic. So once we placed all those jobs, we thought, what are some of the things that we can do to help those students that got that work experience, or youth that were not students but just wanted to try a job in the forest or conservation sector? What can we do beyond that 16-week experience to help grow their skills? And how can we even open it to others that haven't yet participated in this type of program? And so we decided to start a mentorship program, which is also to promote diversity in the workforce, acceptance, inclusion, and grow people's skills. And we kicked that mentorship program off this year, and we were oversubscribed. And so now we're proactively looking at ways that we can partner to expand that platform so that we can provide this service to a wide variety of organizations, either suited directly for them or through a broader platform for all. But it's been a great kickoff and a lot of positive feedback in a short time. I also mentioned that Indigenous careers are really important to us. And while Tara Topping, our Director of Education, has worked with us on the mentorship program, Paul Robitaille, our Senior Manager of Indigenous and Youth Relations, has really helped us to develop a guide to green jobs in Canada that focuses on Indigenous people's jobs and Indigenous peoples that have had different experiences in different parts of the supply chain in the forest sector and in the parks sector as well. And so this guide has just come to life, which is wonderful. And Paul Robitaille, our manager, can help you if you wanted to get copies of that. And then we also have a green jobs guide that we have developed for learners age 12 to 25. And it's also looking at a wide variety of green jobs in the forest sector specifically, and forest management and manufacturing jobs. And it's just a great thing to have as a gift to different high schools, or for employees in your organizations to take home to share with family and friends. So these are some tools that we've created in short order since Project Learning Tree Canada has come about. So now that we've placed youth in jobs and we've got a mentorship program and we've started to look at that career pathway and how we can promote it, we're starting now to look at the employer experience and what employers can do to make their workplace diverse and inclusive, so that these youth that are coming into these jobs or your current employees will feel really welcome and be really satisfied about the place they're working and feeling really strong about that place, and feeling they've made a great decision in their jobs. And so we're doing a 4-part series, webinar series. This is the kickoff on the diversity inclusion of green jobs, the promise of behavioral design, which provides the foundation. And we do need new ways of achieving our diversity and inclusion goals. And behavioral design will help us design our programs to achieve those goals faster and more sustainably. Webinar 2, which is new ways to attract diverse green job candidates, is really specifically designed on your recruitment process to better reach a diverse candidate pool and motivate diverse youth to apply for your jobs. Webinar 3, which is making better hiring decisions when staffing your green job, means you've now got a green pool of diverse youth, but that doesn't mean they'll be hired. This third webinar will look at evidence-based insights to ensure you're hiring the best qualified candidates. So you've reached diverse pools, but you might not select them. What can you do to open your eyes, or perhaps even do some blind hiring, so that you will consider some candidates that you might not otherwise consider? And then webinar 4 is creating an inclusive culture for your green workplace. And this webinar will focus on retention. You've got those youth in your employee base. How are you going to retain them? And like I said, a lot of these things I think will help with retention of existing employees as well. And so while strong recruitment and hiring processes are great, but how do we retain this talent? How can we motivate all workers to stay engaged and empowered? And so we are so thrilled that this webinar series is brought to you in collaboration with Sylvia Apostolidis. Oh, did I do that right? Apostolidis? Is that right? Sylvia, say it for me.
It's Apostolidis.
Apostolidis. Thank you. Apostolidis. I appreciate that. I'm never going to get that wrong again. Sylvia Apostolidis, who's president of the Jazzmar Group. And she is head of this behavioral change consultancy that helps organizations with team belonging and culture development and making inclusion stick. It's been a real pleasure to collaborate with her, to marry her expertise with issues that the forest sector are striving to address, to come up with a unique program that benefits you, hopefully. So Sylvia, over to you, and thanks for all your work on this.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen.
Oh, and I'm going to stop share to make that easy for you. Perfect.
Okay, can everyone, I'm on the same slide as Kathy is right now, so hopefully this works, and if not, you'll just let me know. So Kathy, thanks for the introduction. And also thanks to everyone for joining us on this call today and taking time out of your busy schedules. As Kathy said, we're a behavioral change consultancy. We leverage insights from the behavioral sciences to make faster, more sustainable progress around our D&I goals. I've been in the space working with leading companies across Canada since 2005, 10 years with an organization called Catalyst. And, when speaking with my clients, and even now, there's a level of frustration with respect to the slow rate of progress when we look at engagement levels, when we look at representation levels. And it struck me at the time when I was, thinking about launching this company is, what we're trying to do, and I think I've switched to the next slide here. All right, great. Is, we're trying to change behavior. That is what we're trying to do. We're trying to promote more inclusive behavior, but we're really not bringing an understanding of how people actually behave. And I thought, this is a gap that we really need to fill. And I started digging into the behavioral sciences, because we can't really expect to change behavior unless we bring that understanding of how people actually behave to our solutions. And before I continue, what I'll actually remind you, because Zach asked me to do this, is there's a Q&A function at the bottom. And so please, during this whole presentation, I'll take about half an hour or so, input your questions. Zach will manage them, and then at the end of it, I'll be able to answer those for you. So as we go along, as we have any questions, please do input your questions for me. So today what we're going to do is we're going to discover how behavioral science can solve some of D&I's stickiest problems. We're going to start with, what is behavioral design? This is a fairly new concept, and certainly it's new to the D&I space. In order to fully understand what this is, why it's so powerful, we need to understand a little bit about how we as humans make decisions. So we're going to look at cognitive biases and how those manifest themselves in our decision making before we get into solutions. Solutions in order to make faster progress towards our D&I goals, and introduce the concept called nudging, which is really just designing with these behavioral insights as our backdrop. So what is behavioral design? Behavioral design combines insights from behavioral science, including psychology, economics, and neuroscience, to influence behavior. It's really gained in popularity over the last 10 years or 12 years or so. Really, really quite new, and certainly very new with respect to applying it to inclusion. Behavioral design is used for social good. It's helping people save more money, lift people out of poverty, increase organ donations. In fact, just yesterday, I saw a new research report, and this is an example of how behavioral design works. What they wanted to do is they wanted to help people try to save more money. And so instead of saying to them, okay, and having a program that says, I want you to save $150 a week. Instead, they said, a month. Instead, they said, I want to help, I want you to save $5 a day. Now that is exactly the same thing, $5 a day and $150 a month. But the enrollment with the $5 a day into that savings program quadrupled just by framing it in that different way. That's how behavioral design is actually helping people to save money and do the things that they intend to do. With respect to inclusion, what we can do is we can make changes to our people processes, our recruitment and our talent processes, to help them make more objective decisions. We can better communicate to engage our employees in inclusion, and also to increase buy-in for our senior leaders. We can design our team meetings using behavioral science as well, so that people's voice is amplified and we get to benefit from diversity of thought. We can better create learning programs where people at the end of them act differently for the long term. We can increase uptake of policies like flexibility. We'll talk a little bit about that today, or increase reporting of sexual harassment. And we'll talk how we can do that. So this is what the power of behavioral design is in the inclusion space. Here's a little example of what behavioral design is. In the 1970s, the US orchestras had only 5% of women. So clearly women were just as qualified as men were, but they weren't being hired. So what they did is they actually put a curtain in front of the musicians so that the evaluators couldn't see who was playing, but could only hear them. Now, at first, this didn't work very well because the evaluators could still hear the people walking across the stage and could tell if it was a man or a woman. So what they did is they either had people remove their shoes or carpet the floor. This small design increased the number of women so that today it's about 40 or 50% in the US. This is an example of how we can design a small little change makes a big difference in our outcomes. So this is a little bit about how our approach works. If there's anything that you take from today, it's this. The big idea is think small. Now, this is totally counterintuitive to what we actually are taught. We're taught to think big. It's not to say to not have big goals, but how you get there is through small changes. It's a small wins approach. We'll talk about that small wins approach on the individual actions, like the habits that you can build, but also the changes that you can make to your processes so that you interrupt bias and you help people make more objective decisions, be more inclusive. So think small, act small. It's counterintuitive, yes, but it's absolutely the fastest way to workplace inclusion. So I'm going to start with a poll, and Zach, I'm going to ask you to help me out here. And I want you to pick all that apply for you. What are some of the challenges that you're having at your organization when it comes to diversity and inclusion? So I'll give it a minute or so, and if everyone can help us out here, and that would be great. Okay, so I'll leave it open for a few more, for about another 20 seconds or so. Okay, so what we had here is that 63% of you looked at the lack of role models is excluding women and members of non-majority groups. So we know that a lot of industries, including the forestry industries, are male-dominated, and it is one of the reasons, and certainly what you're telling us here today, that that people may not be joining the industry. Behavioral design can absolutely help to mitigate this. Leaders don't understand the benefits. We're going to actually talk about that, and I'm going to share some nudges that you can do when you go back to your organization, specifically around how do we get leaders to buy in. Talent shortages for skilled workers is a worrisome trend. So we'll be addressing that in webinar 4 when we also look at the engagement levels. And how do we make sure that we create an inclusive culture so that everyone is engaged? So that's awesome. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. That's really, really informative. Now, I'm going to close this. We know, and this is not going to be new to many of you on the call today, that D&I is absolutely imperative, as Kathy was saying, to our success. It drives performance. So research shows that companies with a track record of continual innovation are far more likely to describe themselves as highly inclusive than those that only innovate sporadically. There's a plethora of research around diverse thinking teams are better decision makers. There's less flawed decisions. They're able to mitigate overconfidence and basically get to more innovation. Inclusion also prepares us for the future of work. It's one of the things that we just talked about, or we just saw in the poll. There is a demand for skilled labor, and skilled workers are going to go to organizations that are more inclusive, that do have equality, and can continue to create environments where everyone is equal. So it prepares us for this future workforce. And similarly, more and more youth are looking at purpose. in an organization. They want meaning in an organization. Having and actually in just last year, there was a U.S. business roundtable. There's about 200 organizations on this roundtable, and it's quite an influential group. And what they've actually said just last year, trying to balance the profitability and purpose, is companies should protect the environment, foster diversity, inclusion, respect, and dignity at work, and support communities, all while generating shareholder value. So there's a balance between that. And we know the forestry industry is doing this work, co-creating, for example, solutions with the Indigenous community, bridging divides, increasing loyalty, engagement, and well-being. But here's the challenge. As Albert Einstein says, insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. When we look at how we've been approaching diversity and inclusion, Albert Einstein might actually say we're a little insane. Now, are we insane? No, of course we're not. But are we sort of stuck in the status quo? Yeah, we are. We have tick the box initiatives, a lot of programs that are based on assumption and not necessarily evidence. What actually does work? Often we look at other companies and we ask for best practice. But when we look at representation levels and engagement levels in, leading companies, they're pretty stagnant. So, I really question, is best practice really best practice? And I would argue that it's not. What we've been doing really makes us feel good, but actually isn't really getting the results that we want. And this is actually why a behavioral-based approach is more promising, in that it gets to the evidence behind it. A really good example of this is around diversity awareness training. In the US, $8 billion is spent on diversity awareness training. But what we're finding is there's not really the results, and there's backlash. So when people leave diversity awareness training, there's research that shows that they're even more biased after this training. They almost have a moral licensing. It's like, now I took this training, and so therefore. Now, they don't do this consciously, but it's really not having the impact that we want. And the reason is, and this is an important point, is that awareness does not lead to behavior change. We think that awareness does, and it makes sense, but think about it. My belief is that everyone should be doing everything we can to protect the planet. And I think that recycling is a very, positive thing in that regard. But that doesn't mean that me and probably a whole bunch of other people on this call as well, when we have a pop can, we don't occasionally throw it into the garbage bin. So I'm aware that this is not good behavior for the environment, but still I do it. So awareness and behaviors, they're not really aligned. And yet awareness, diversity training is really stuck on awareness. That's not to say it's not a good first step. It is, but it's not enough at all. Another example is, do I believe in gender equality? Of course I do. I recently did a talk, and I started out with, I'm sexist as I'm racist. And it's because we all are. My belief doesn't mean that sometimes I don't act. I act in a way that is based on assumptions. It recently just happened a couple of days ago. My children, Jason and Marco, aka the Jazzmar group, they're almost 13 years old, and they're selling all their Lego. And somebody wanted to buy a bunch of it. This person's name was B-E-E-E. And on their Facebook page, they had a pink image. And it was Mother's Day. And so there was a lot of back and forth with this person. And I said, Happy Mother's Day, to you. She goes, no, I'm actually the father. So my assumptions based on the color pink, based on this person and how they were communicating, was that this person was actually a woman that I was speaking to. So what I believe, these implicit assumptions actually make a difference around how we behave, how we act, regardless of whether or not we're aware of these things, regardless of our knowledge. It really needs to start with behavior first. We see this in the inclusion space. You know, we present the business case to leaders, they get it, they're aware of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their behaviors are going to change. We explain to hiring managers the importance of diversity of thinking, they get it. It doesn't mean that they won't hire someone that's very similar to them. We tell leaders to act inclusively in their team meeting, they get it, but that doesn't mean that they won't pick the person that is closest to them or similar to them for that next promotion. So awareness does not lead to behavior change. And part of the reason is that, we're really not all that rational, yet we've been approaching diversity and inclusion in a very rational way. As much as 90 to 99% of our thought processes occur automatically. We think that we're consciously making these decisions, but so many of them, the majority of them, fly under our radar, and they're very automatic. And when I first heard about this number, I was just appalled. I thought, no, like 100% of my decisions are actually rational. But then when I thought about, driving my kids to their piano lesson and how many decisions I make that are just automatic, where to turn, where to stop, when to go, all of these things. We make, thousands of decisions every day, and we could not operate without this automatic system. And yet it is wrought with cognitive biases. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the cognitive biases and what they are and how they impact our decisions. I'm just going to highlight 5 of them really, really quickly so that you understand what we're trying to actually mitigate. So one of the main cognitive biases, there's about 150 to 200 cognitive biases. Again, they fly under our radar. They're largely beyond our control. They're unconscious in nature. And so one of the main ones is similarity bias. We basically like people like ourselves, and we treat them much better. We process people that are in our in-group, people that look like us, people that have a similar background, that have similar education, that live in the same neighborhood. People that are similar to us, we process them in the same part of the brain as we process ourselves. So how do you mitigate this? How do you bring people in to our in-group and hence start treating them in an equal way? And the way we do that is we find commonalities. So if we try to find commonalities with people, bring them into our in-group, our brain automatically starts treating them better. Other one that comes up in the workplace is halo bias. So basically, this one is if we think that, if we see one characteristic about a person that's really positive, then we think all the other characteristics about this person are also positive. So for example, we like extroverts. And so we will think that that a lot of other qualities about that person are really good. Compare that to introverts. So introverts in our society are not as liked. Now, I don't agree with that at all, because introverts have a huge value to as well. But yet we still do that. So that gives introverts a disadvantage in that way. If we think that, another example, height is attractive, automatically we think someone who is taller. And so we attribute other positive qualities to somebody that is taller. If we see that someone's done really well and has done a great job on a research project, then we'll think that, okay, something else that they're doing, a speech, let's say, that must be good too. We do that all the time, and we do the opposite as well. People we dislike, other characteristics we also view it as negative as well. And this shows up in our performance and also in how we recruit as well. Another one is anchoring bias. So we rely too much on the initial piece of information that we see. So this is kind of a well-known example is around negotiation. You know, the first number that you negotiate with anchors us to the rest of the way the negotiation falls out. Or even when you price something in a store, if you price something at $100 and you get it on sale for $30, you feel really good about it. And so this anchoring bias is used in that way. In the workplace, we anchor to a name on a resume. If that name is similar to ours, we'll treat that person differently. We anchor to language. So if you refer to top talent as top talent, but then you refer to diverse and use diverse top talent, that word diverse actually anchors us to difference and less than. You know, that group, that diverse needs help. So we actually advocate for not using those words like diverse, because it anchors us. Same with someone when they're looking at a job posting. They'll look for words that anchor them to, do I feel like I belong? And we'll talk about this in the next webinar when we're looking at how do we word job postings so that people do feel that they belong, that they anchor to belonging rather than, I don't think I'm going to fit in here as well as I would like. The next one that I want to point out is confirmation bias. So, you know, we seek out information that confirms our beliefs. So we see this in politics a lot these days. An example of this, you might say, well, people from this high profile company are excellent hires. So we believe that, and therefore that person is an excellent hire. So we need to figure out ways to mitigate that. One way that we can do is we can slow down our thinking and consider the opposite. Consider the opposite to what we believe. Another way is to bring other people in to make sure that we're actually not succumbing to this bias. The last one is authority bias. So we attribute greater accuracy and are more influenced by people, by the opinions of people in power, in authority. Research indicates that even when everyone within a group recognizes who the subject matter expert is, they only defer to that person 62% of the time. So this authority bias, and it's not just the person who has the most authority, but it's also the person that is the most extroverted as well. That actually implicates our decisions as well. They compromise our decisions. So we need to figure out ways for all of these biases, again, that fly under our radar. We don't see these in action and beyond our control. How do we design out of them? That's what behavioral design is, and that's what we want to talk about. All of these biases, manifest themselves into stereotypes. So, stereotypes on gender, race, age, weight, ability, so many different things. And the stereotypes lead to extra scrutiny. So an example of this is even when men and women have identical performance ratings, men get promoted more than women do. Okay, so identical performance ratings, how do you design out of that? So here's one thing that you can try. So let's say you have all your candidates and you're in a talent calibration meeting and you're deciding who's going to get promoted. You're in that room. Research has shown that simply hanging photos of people, non-majority group members, whether that's women, whether that's Indigenous people, whether that's people from the LGBT community, if you hang photos of leaders or people on the wall, that actually triggers something in our brain and has led to more non-majority women and non-majority group members being promoted. That's an example of a small change, a small that doesn't even cost us any money, that actually makes an impact around promotion and mitigates this this stereotype. Another one is the double bind. So, which is really, if you act outside of your stereotype, you're not likable and not trusted. And certainly we see this double bind. Oops, that was my fault. Trying to move there we go. We see this happen with the double bind with women all the time. The last one is shifting criteria. So here are some examples. Younger workers have the exact same resume as older workers, but get less callbacks. This has also happened with women. It's also happened with race. So identical resumes with white sounding names received more callbacks than those with black sounding names and Latino names. So often we shift our criteria based on what we're more comfortable with. So we all have bias. We all have these stereotypes. That doesn't make us bad people, but it does mean that we need to do something about it. What does work, though? What's really important to understand is how bias works. So it's very, very difficult to see bias in yourself in real time. You can see it, you can plan for it. So if you're going into an interview and okay, I have enough knowledge, I understand that, all of these biases can impact, you can plan for it. You can see it after the fact often, just like I did with the example of my kid's Lego. I saw it after the fact, but not when I was in it in the moment. And you can see it in other people. And that's why it's really important that as a team, you have that common knowledge so that you're able to, sort of call out your team members in a nice way, of course, in a respectful way around, hey, was that similarity bias when you decided that you wanted to hire the person? So you can see it in other people. And that's why psychological safety in your teams is really important. So I want to stop here and I want to take another poll here. And I want to ask, what is your organization doing with respect to trying to mitigate bias in your organizations? We'll take a little bit of time here. And again, this is a pick all that apply. Okay, so diversity training. Okay, I'm not gonna, still waiting for. Okay, so we've got diversity training. And again, that's a really good first step. What we want to make sure is that it's focused on behaviors, not just awareness. Leadership coaching is also really effective as well. So that's really great news. I love seeing the habit building. We're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about redesigning people processes. The nothing, what I always say about the nothing is there's a huge opportunity. And especially, organizations that aren't doing anything have an opportunity to really learn about what does work. So I'm happy to have you to be sharing all of this with you today. Okay, so let me close that. So how does culture change happen? So we talked about habit building. So small little incremental changes are the best way to get to those big goals. You can think about, trying to, if you want to work out, this is the example outside of inclusion, instead of saying I'm going to go to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, you actually just say, I'm going to do 3 sit-ups. That small little thing that you do, that habit actually is going to lead you to bigger change. So we're going to talk about habit building, not so much today, but in subsequent webinars. What we're going to talk today about is choice architecture. How can you alter the environment in which decisions are made? Because remember, you can't alter the human brain, but you can alter the environment in which decisions are being made. So this is what a nudge is. We design to activate drivers of influence that we know will help people align their intentions with their actions. So we take what we know about human behavior and we design. We know that people are more, will change more based on the emotions rather than facts. So if you can tap into emotion, I'm going to show you how we can do that with respect to leadership buy-in, then that's much more effective. Our brain loves structure, our brain loves simplicity. These are all behavioral drivers that we know from the sciences, and we're going to apply them to nudge, to design. What I'm going to share with you today is low cost or no cost, does not rely on fines or punishment or threats or anything like that, and choice is never taken away. People can decide any way they want to do. They want to act. We're just creating an environment where their intentions to be inclusive actually align with their actions. Let's see how it's applied in externally. So an example of some external nudges, just to give you some examples. In Copenhagen, people saw themselves as not litterers, but they littered. And so the city said, okay, they tried punishment like fines and rewards, and none of that was working. So they ended up just putting footsteps towards the garbage bin. This was the most effective strategy to decrease littering. And it was just basically something visual that reminded them, and that worked, because we know that that is a behavioral driver, reminders, visual. Here's another example as well. So these signs to not litter on the beach weren't working. And so they put this big fish, you could see right through it. And that's how they collected more garbage. So this is how, instead of how we typically approach change, which is first starting with the change, here we're starting with see it, feel it. It's like, oh my goodness, if I don't throw it in here, I'm going to be killing all these fish in the water. And then change, act differently. So that's an example, low cost, no fines, no rewards, no punishment, it works. Another example is if you see your electricity bill. Now, on our electricity bill, we get to see how we compare our energy consumption compared to our neighbors. And that has actually decreased energy consumption, because a behavioral insight is around comparability. We compare ourselves to other people. So you use that and help to you use that in designing for more inclusion. Let's see how. Here's an example of a simple sign. So they use this on a construction site, men and women at work, instead of the typical sign that says men at work. This sends a message that women are welcome on the site, and it also creates a social norm. Another construction site, we're having a real problem because the men were using the women's washrooms. So they told the men, don't do that, but they still kept using the women's washrooms. So they painted the door pink. The men stopped using the washrooms. Now, I don't advocate for having men pink and blue colors, and hopefully that will change over time. But right now, we associate those colors. So how do we use this concept of nudging so we make more for inclusion, for diversity and inclusion in the workplace? Here's a challenge that many of you said you have. So you may be able to try this. So in this particular company, the leaders weren't really buying into the sponsorship program. They just did, for women. They just didn't think it was necessary. And so what they did, what was done is they took all the people that were up for promotion and they put them on a slide, and they said to the leaders in the room, I said, who do you know? And everyone started calling out saying, I know that person, I know that person, I know that person. And then they took all the men away and they said, who do you know? And it's like crickets. They didn't know anybody. And in that moment, that concept, it triggered emotion. So people, they saw it, they felt it, and then they changed. So regardless of the facts that we were presenting to the leadership team, it didn't really make the impact. But if you can try to figure out ways to trigger emotion, you're going to get to more results. Another thing that you can do, because our brain hates ambiguity and loves simplicity, is offer a clear path. So instead of saying to a leader, okay, I want you to reach these representation numbers, I want you, and have an ambiguous goal for them. This is your goal for the year. Instead, provide a very scripted path on how they can get there. You're going to get to better results. One way to do that is a simple if-then statement. You know, if I go to my team meeting on a weekly basis, I will ensure that I speak last so that you mitigate authority bias. You have that, you create as much structure and simplicity so that people, so that the brain doesn't get tired, the rational brain doesn't get tired, because that's actually what happens, and then it will switch over to the automatic brain. Simplicity, clear path, if-then statements are really, really powerful. I know you might be thinking, oh my goodness, this is just so small, but evidence points to them being incredibly powerful. Another thing to do is show majority data first. So instead of showing data around the low representation of women, for example, because we know that's so common, instead switch it, you know, and create a jolt in your brain, if you will, because it's jarring to see 90% of men are leaders first. So how you present data actually can have a big impact as well. If you want to increase team buy-in, sort of same kind of idea here. Here's the behavioral insight. If I were walking along the street and I saw $10 on the street, I'd say, oh, I feel really good. If I lost $10, I would feel twice as bad. So if you can not focus on the benefits of diversity, but instead focus on the risks of diversity when you're communicating, that will actually potentially have more impact as well. So instead of why diversity, instead say, why not diversity? Instead of looking at a team of what you will gain, instead say, what will we lose in a team? And then you'll get more buy-in by focusing on loss. We talked about this one as well, which is, you know, that word, women's mentoring program, anchors us to difference. It divides. So drop it. So let's just go with mentoring program instead, because we anchor to that first piece of information that we see. So, and it also takes us away from the idea that we need to fix the women. We don't need to fix the women. We so don't need to fix the women. We so don't need to fix the non-majority groups that aren't getting the opportunity. We really need to be fixing the system instead. Another one, defaults are incredibly powerful as well. So create all roles, flex roles. Like if all roles are defaulted as all roles to be flexible, which is what one company did, then they actually increased the number of people the uptake in flexible work arrangements. Another way you can use this is to help your employees save more money and enroll in the retirement program. Instead of having them start with your organization and then have to enroll in your retirement plan, default them in, because you want to make it as easy as possible. So defaults are really popular and really powerful as well. Another one that you can try as well in order to mitigate sort of stereotype threat is to expose women to role models prior to an important event. So there was, so it's this idea of priming. So like girls as young as 6 years old believe that boys are smarter. We teach this at a very young age. It's so ingrained in us. And so, in order to mitigate that, and that just exists, you can prime women beforehand with these positive role models. That is shown to help. One example was that they performed much better in a speech. You can also do the same when you can get them to write down their worth before a exam or before an interview, what their value is to the organization. That kind of priming and embedding that into your process actually makes a difference, so that we see their actual skill rather than and boost their confidence more, not just for women, but for all other non-majority groups as well. The last one I want to share with you before I open it up to questions is this simple thing of having your CEO send a message to all your staff to self-nominate for promotions. So the example here was Google had a difference in software engineer promotions by gender. They removed this gap by having a senior leader send a message to everyone, encouraging all engineers to self-nominate if they were ready for a promotion. And that actually equaled out all the number of promotions. So that simple thing of having some leader to send a message out, no cost, but actually did have a big difference with respect to promotion. So these are just some examples. Now, all of these aren't focused on recruitment. They aren't really focused on engagement. We're going to be tackling that in webinars 2, 3, and 4. And these are the kinds of things that we're going to be tackling in our next webinar. Do diversity statements matter? Oops, did that again. I'm trying to move there we go. Do diversity statements matter? How many words is optimal in a job posting from the evidence? Like, is it longer, shorter? What really, how many words matter? What kind of words would ensure that people are motivated to apply and that that they feel like they would belong? Where should I post? All of these will be taken care of in this, or these nudges to solve some of these problems or these issues will also be shared in our next webinar. So that was sort of an overview of what some of the things that you can do today and where we're going. Zach, I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to open it up to questions. We've got a few minutes left for
the Q&As here. I don't see any coming in, so just a reminder that you can type them in, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question over audio.
I have a question. So I saw the impressive results with the blind additions for the orchestra. So therefore, is the equivalent in the workplace, perhaps in hiring folks, to white out, remove the names from the CVs, and to perhaps remove the educational institution if somehow it may reveal a certain geography or country or what have you. Is that sort of what you would do from a workplace recruitment perspective? Is that one of the tips?
Yeah, that's absolutely one of the tips. And we see a lot of companies actually doing that right now. Is exactly what you're saying, is remove any identifying information, including education, the name, because again, the anchoring, we anchor to a name. And even a university that is, someone who's educated in Canada versus someone that's educated outside of Canada, we have a bias towards that, but that doesn't mean that that person's not a really great candidate. So let's remove that information as well. And there's a whole bunch of really cool other things that I'm going to share next time, but I will share one because it's just, I think, really powerful. So instead of instead of reviewing resumes one at a time, if you lay them out, and or either electronically or with paper, which people don't necessarily do. So, but if you compare them, lay them out side by side, this is actually shown to decrease the gender, to eliminate the gender gap because of the insight around comparability. We compare, so that's so simple, right? Like, you just, instead of one at a time to review resumes, lay them out and eliminate the gender gap. So those are the kinds of things that we'll be sharing in the next couple of webinars.
Sylvia, I have one question here that came in, and we might address it in webinar 3, I believe. But the question is, how do hiring managers respond to blind hiring? We sometimes have issues with taking that autonomy away from them, or it's a perceived removal of autonomy.
Right, and I think that's a really big challenge, and I think overall, what we need to do is communicate to our hiring managers as to why we're doing this. And so there is, and help them understand the impact of bias around this. And that also the company to take a stance around, we know this impacts the quality of our candidates. And this is part of the way we recruit at the organization right now. So trying to bring them into that conversation is a way to sort of mitigate that autonomy, because I get, like, people need to feel like they're in control. It's actually one of our psychological needs. So we want to keep that, but at the same time also say, the structure of a process is what is really going to interrupt that bias, and we need everyone to engage in this.
Great. One other question here. How can employers avoid tokenism when implementing inclusion and diversity?
Okay, so that's a big question. So you always want to hire the best person for the job. If people feel like there is tokenism, then they feel that that it's not necessarily fair. So one way to ensure that there's fairness is to be as transparent around the process as you possibly can be. If people see the process and there's a transparency, regardless of the outcome, they'll be okay with it. So that's one aspect of it. And the other part of it is really looking at your competencies within the organization. Are the competencies that we're hiring for actually the competencies that are required to lead diverse thinking teams? Often they're not. We think, for example, that confidence is correlated with competence in an organization, in your job. It's not. In fact, overconfidence is a huge problem, and yet we hire based on confidence. And so I would look at your competencies and how you're hiring. Be really, really clear around, why these are important to the organization, and are they really aligned to leadership as well. To try to be really careful that we're actually really hiring the best, most qualified person for the job. And right now, we're not, right? We're not hiring the best people for the job.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Sylvia. I personally found that very, very educational, and I learned a lot. We are coming up to the top of the hour, so I just wanted to mention that our next webinar is on June 10th. It's focusing on new ways to attract diverse green job candidates. And so following the end of this webinar, we'll be sending you a survey for your feedback. And you can also submit any challenges that you face specifically so that we can address them in the next webinar. And I'd like to thank Sylvia for joining us and everyone else for attending. Together, it's through these conversations that you're helping to grow future forest and conservation leaders. And I'll just hand it over to Kathy if there's anything else you'd like to close out on.
Yes, I would like to also thank you, Zach. Zach's our manager of Green Jobs, and he's played an important role in pulling this together and working with everyone to produce this webinar series. So thank you for your hard work, Zach, and also to Paul Robitaille, our Senior Manager of Indigenous and Youth Relations, and of course to Sylvia, as I already mentioned at the beginning of the call. So, and thanks to everyone who joined us. We're looking forward to having you participate in future webinars.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you.